The fluorescent lights of the small-town grocery store hummed like tired insects above aisle 7, where a 90-year-old woman with silver hair pulled into a tight military bun stood at the checkout counter, her trembling hands placing something onto the conveyor belt that made the young cashier freeze mid-motion. It wasn't a coupon. It wasn't a credit card. It was a Navy cross, tarnished by decades, but still unmistakable, resting beside a silver star and a purple heart that had been pinned to her chest 50 years earlier on a hospital ship off the coast of Vietnam. "I don't have enough cash," she whispered, her voice steady despite the shame burning in her chest. "Will these cover the bread and the soup? They're real. I earned them." Behind her, a Marine in his early 30s stood holding a leash attached to a German shepherd named Ranger. And what he saw in that moment would change the trajectory of 2 lives forever. Because this woman wasn't just any elderly customer trying to stretch her last dollar. She was Commander Eleanor Hayes, one of the first women ever to serve in a Navy SEAL-adjacent combat support role. A decorated war hero whose name had been quietly erased from the records she helped write. How does a nation forget the people who bled for it? Tell me in the comments. Would you have stepped forward, or would you have looked away? Eleanor Hayes was born in 1935 in a coal mining town in West Virginia. The third of 6 children in a household where dinner was sometimes a single potato split between siblings, and where her father came home from the mines with black lungs and a quiet rage that he buried in long silences. Her mother, a seamstress who had lost 2 brothers in World War II, raised Eleanor on stories of sacrifice and on the unshakable belief that a woman's worth was not measured by her softness, but by the steel she carried inside her. By the time Eleanor was 12, she could shoot a rifle better than any boy in her county, taught by her uncle who had returned from the Pacific missing 3 fingers and most of his hearing. He told her once, sitting on the porch as the sun bled orange behind the mountains, that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward while your hands were still shaking. She never forgot those words. When she graduated high school in 1953, the Korean War was winding down, and the idea of a woman serving in any meaningful military capacity was still considered scandalous in most circles. But Eleanor had read every news clipping about the waves, the women who had served in the Navy during the previous war. And she had decided long before her 18th birthday that she would wear that uniform or die trying. Her father refused to sign her enlistment papers. Her mother signed them in secret, slipping them into Eleanor's hand the night before she left, whispering that some doors only open when you're brave enough to walk toward them alone. Eleanor boarded a bus to Norfolk, Virginia, with a single canvas bag, $42 in her pocket, and a conviction that burned hotter than the August sun pressing against the windows. Boot camp was brutal in ways she had not anticipated, not because of the physical demands, which she met without complaint, but because of the relentless message that women existed in the Navy to type letters, file papers, and serve coffee to men who would do the real work. Eleanor refused to accept this. She volunteered for every additional training opportunity, learned medical triage, mastered radio operations, and quietly outperformed her male peers in marksmanship qualifications until her instructors began to notice. One of those instructors, a hardened chief petty officer named Walter Briggs, pulled her aside one rainy afternoon and told her that she had something rare, a combination of grit and intelligence that the Navy desperately needed but would never openly reward. He told her to keep her head down, build her record, and wait for the right moment. That moment, he promised, would come. Eleanor did exactly as he advised, and over the next decade, she built a reputation as the most reliable enlisted woman on every base she touched, earning promotion after promotion, learning languages, studying tactical operations on her own time, and waiting patiently for a war that would force the Navy to use her properly. That war came in 1965, and its name was Vietnam. By the time American involvement in Vietnam escalated, Eleanor had risen to the rank of lieutenant and had been quietly attached to a medical and intelligence unit operating aboard the USS Repose, a hospital ship stationed off the coast near Da Nang. The official records would later describe her role as administrative support, but the truth was far more complicated. Eleanor had been selected, along with a handful of other exceptional women, for a classified program that integrated female personnel into combat-adjacent operations involving the early Navy SEAL teams, particularly in roles requiring medical expertise, language fluency, and the kind of cool nerve that didn't crack under fire. She spoke conversational Vietnamese, having taught herself during long deployments. And she had a steady hand under pressure that made her invaluable during emergency surgeries performed while mortars fell within earshot. Her first taste of real combat came on a humid night in November 1966, when a SEAL extraction team returned to the ship carrying 3 wounded operators. One of them bleeding out from a stomach wound that the field medic had been unable to stabilize. Eleanor scrubbed in alongside the surgeon, held the man's intestines in place with her gloved hands while the doctor worked, and spoke softly to him in the dark hours before dawn, telling him about the mountains of West Virginia and the way the fog rolled through the hollows in autumn. He survived. His name was Master Chief Daniel Rourke, and he would become one of the few men who knew exactly what Eleanor did during the war and who would spend the rest of his life trying to make sure she received credit for it. The lessons Eleanor learned during those years were lessons that no academy could teach. She learned that leadership was not about rank, but about the willingness to be the first one through the door, the last one to eat, and the only one still standing when everyone else had given up. She learned that teamwork meant trusting people whose names you might never know with your life. And that perseverance was a muscle that grew stronger only when it was tested past the point of breaking. She learned that the military's official history and its actual history were often 2 very different things, and that women like her would have to fight twice as hard to leave even a faint mark on the record. There were nights when she wept silently in her bunk, exhausted beyond description, mourning men whose death she had witnessed and whose families she could never contact. There were mornings when she pinned her uniform with hands still stained from the previous night's surgery and walked onto the deck to face another day with the same composure she had carried since childhood. By the time her tour ended in 1969, she had been awarded the Silver Star for her actions during a mass casualty event, the Purple Heart for shrapnel wounds sustained during a mortar attack on the ship, and a quiet, off-the-books commendation from the SEAL community that she would never be allowed to display publicly. She came home to a country that did not want to hear about Vietnam, that crossed the street to avoid men in uniform, and that had no category at all for a woman who had done what she had done. Eleanor's return to civilian life was not the celebrated homecoming she had once imagined as a young recruit boarding that bus to Norfolk. The country she had served had grown bitter and divided, and the Navy itself, eager to bury the more controversial aspects of its Vietnam-era operations, quietly reassigned her to a desk job in Washington and made it clear that her classified work would remain classified, which in practice meant it would remain invisible. She married Daniel Rourke in 1971, the Master Chief whose life she had saved, and for a few golden years they built a quiet life in a small house in Virginia Beach, raising a daughter named Margaret and pretending that the war had not followed them home. But Daniel had carried wounds that no surgeon could close, and in 1983, he took his own life on a cold February morning, leaving Eleanor a widow at 48 with a teenage daughter and a grief so vast she sometimes felt she was drowning in it. She did what she had always done. She kept moving forward. She finished her Navy career as a commander, retired in 1990, and took a civilian job teaching emergency medical procedures to young corpsmen at a training facility near Norfolk. She poured herself into Margaret, and when Margaret grew up and became a Navy nurse herself, Eleanor felt for the first time in years that her life had carried meaning forward into another generation. Then came the second great loss. Margaret was killed in 2004 when a transport helicopter went down off the coast of Bahrain during a non-combat training mission, and Eleanor, then 69 years old, found herself standing alone at another military funeral, accepting another folded flag, listening to another bugler play taps for someone she loved more than her own life. She had no other family. Her parents were long gone. Her siblings had scattered or passed. The pension she lived on had seemed adequate in 1990, but inflation, medical bills from a heart condition that developed in her 70s, and the slow erosion of the dollar had reduced her monthly budget to a number that would not cover both her medications and her groceries. She refused to ask for help. The pride that had carried her through boot camp, through Vietnam, through 2 devastating losses, would not allow her to call a hotline or stand in a food bank line. She cut her own hair. She mended her own clothes. She walked to the grocery store because she had sold her car years earlier. And on the morning of the day that everything changed, she had counted the coins in her purse 3 times before leaving her small apartment. And she had known with cold certainty that she did not have enough. She had taken her medals from the wooden box on her dresser, the box Daniel had built her as an anniversary gift, and she had wrapped them in a handkerchief and placed them in her purse, telling herself that surely, someone would understand what they were worth. Surely the country she had bled for would not let her go hungry. The Marine standing behind her in line that morning was Sergeant Marcus Delgado, 32 years old. Recently medical retired after 11 years of active duty that had included 3 deployments to Afghanistan and a roadside bomb in Helmand province that had taken most of the hearing in his left ear and given him a traumatic brain injury that still woke him in the middle of the night. Beside him stood Ranger, his K-9 partner from his final deployment, a German shepherd the Marine Corps had allowed him to adopt after the dog suffered a leg injury that ended his working life. Marcus had come to the small grocery store that morning because Ranger needed a specific brand of sensitive stomach food, and because Marcus himself was trying, slowly and imperfectly, to rebuild a normal civilian life in a town where nobody knew his history and nobody asked. He saw the medals before he heard the words. The Navy Cross caught the fluorescent light in a way that made his breath stop, because Marcus knew exactly what that medal meant, knew that it was the second highest decoration the Navy could award, knew that it was almost never given to women of Eleanor's generation and almost never given without a story behind it that the public would never hear. He stepped forward before he had consciously decided to move. "Ma'am," he said quietly, placing his own debit card on the counter beside her medals. "Please put those back in your purse. I've got this." Eleanor turned to look at him, and the expression on her face was not gratitude. It was something closer to anger, the fierce dignity of a woman who had spent 90 years refusing to be a charity case. "Young man," she said, her voice low and steady, "I don't take handouts." Marcus held her gaze without flinching. "It's not a handout, ma'am. It's a thank you. I'm Sergeant Marcus Delgado, United States Marine Corps, retired. And I'm guessing from those medals that you've earned about 100 thank yous more than you've ever received." Something in Eleanor's face shifted then, a small crack in the armor she had worn for 50 years. Ranger, sensing the emotional shift the way trained dogs always do, stepped forward and pressed his nose gently against the back of her hand. She looked down at the dog, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, her composure broke. Just a single tear, brushed away quickly with the back of her wrist, but Marcus saw it, and he understood. He paid for her groceries, all of them, and added a small bag of fresh fruit and a carton of eggs that she had not allowed herself to put in her basket. He carried the bags to her apartment, 3 blocks away, with Ranger trotting beside them, and when they reached her door, he asked if he could come in for a cup of coffee. Eleanor hesitated. Then she nodded. What followed was a 3-hour conversation that neither of them would ever forget, a conversation in which Eleanor, for the first time in decades, told someone the truth about what she had done in Vietnam, and Marcus, for the first time since coming home, felt the heavy weight of his own war begin to ease. In the weeks that followed that first encounter, Marcus made it his quiet mission to ensure that Eleanor Hayes would never again have to choose between her medications and her meals. He did not do this with grand gestures or public announcements. He did it the way Marines do most meaningful things, methodically, persistently, and without asking permission. He drove her to her medical appointments. He installed safety bars in her bathroom. He taught Ranger to recognize her apartment building. And on the days when Marcus was working his new job as a security consultant, Ranger would sometimes wait by Eleanor's door until she opened it, simply because the dog had decided she was part of his pack now. But Marcus also did something more important. He began, with Eleanor's reluctant permission, to investigate her service record. He reached out to a network of veterans who specialized in helping older service members recover benefits and recognition that had been lost or denied. He contacted a journalist at a small military publication who had built a reputation for telling the stories of forgotten women in uniform. And he reconnected Eleanor with 2 surviving members of the SEAL team she had supported in Vietnam, men in their late 70s now. Men who had spent 50 years wondering what had happened to the lieutenant who had saved their lives and never received the public recognition she deserved. The process was slow and frustrating in the way that all dealings with bureaucracy are slow and frustrating. There were forms that had been lost. There were classifications that had to be reviewed. There were officials who initially insisted that the records Marcus was requesting did not exist, and there were moments when Eleanor told him, with the weariness of a woman who had been through this before, that perhaps it was time to let it go. But Marcus refused to let it go. He had learned in the Marines that you do not leave anyone behind, not on the battlefield and not in civilian life. And he had decided that Eleanor Hayes was not going to spend her final years invisible. The lessons that emerged from those months of work were lessons in resilience and in the quiet power of one person refusing to accept injustice. Marcus learned that leadership at its truest is not about commanding others, but about advocating for those who can no longer advocate for themselves. Eleanor, for her part, learned that asking for help was not the same as weakness, that allowing someone to honor your service was a gift you gave to them as much as one you received. Their friendship deepened in ways that surprised them both. She became something like a grandmother to him, and he became something like the son she had never had. Ranger, in his own canine wisdom, simply considered them all his responsibility now, a small pack to be guarded and loved without complication. And then, one cold morning in March, a letter arrived at Eleanor's apartment bearing the seal of the Department of the Navy, and her hands trembled as she opened it. And Marcus watched her face as she read the words that confirmed what he had been fighting for. Her record was being formally reviewed. Her classified service was being declassified. The Navy was, at long last, preparing to recognize Commander Eleanor Hayes for what she had truly done. The ceremony took place 6 months later in a small auditorium at the Naval Heritage Center in Washington, D.C., on a clear October morning that felt, to Eleanor, like a gift she had not expected to receive in this lifetime. She wore her dress uniform, which Marcus had carefully restored, the brass polished to a mirror shine, the ribbons aligned with the precision she had demanded of herself for 70 years. Her hair was still in that tight military bun, though the silver had thinned to something closer to white. She walked into the auditorium on Marcus's arm, with Ranger walking patiently on her other side wearing a service vest. And she was met by an audience that included the 2 surviving SEALs from her old team, now elderly men with tears already in their eyes. Also present were active duty sailors and Marines, journalists, members of Congress, and a small contingent of young women in Navy uniforms who had been brought to the ceremony specifically because the admiral presiding believed they needed to see what was about to happen. The citation that was read aloud described actions that had been classified for 57 years. It described a woman who had repeatedly volunteered for missions outside her assigned role, who had saved the lives of at least 11 SEAL operators through direct medical intervention under fire, who had translated intercepted communications that prevented an ambush that would have killed an entire platoon, and who had done all of this while being told, officially and unofficially, that her contributions did not count and would never be acknowledged. The admiral who pinned the additional decoration on Eleanor's chest that day was a woman, the first female 4-star admiral in Navy history, and she paused before stepping back and said, into a microphone that carried her voice to every corner of the room, that she would not be standing where she stood if women like Eleanor Hayes had not endured what they endured. Eleanor's response was brief. She had prepared remarks, but set them aside. She thanked the families of the men she had served with, the ones still living and the ones long gone. She thanked Marcus, who stood near the front with Rangers sitting at perfect attention beside him. And then she turned to the young women in uniform and told them something she said she had waited her entire life to be able to say out loud. She told them that the country would not always see them, that the records would not always remember them, that there would be days when the weight of being unseen would feel heavier than any pack they had ever carried. But she told them, with the same fierce conviction her uncle had given her on that West Virginia porch 78 years earlier, that their service mattered whether anyone acknowledged it or not, that the people whose lives they would touch would carry their names forward in ways no medal could capture, and that the truth, in the end, has a way of finding the light. The room rose to its feet. The applause lasted nearly 4 minutes. And in the back row, an old Navy SEAL who had been carried bleeding onto a hospital ship in 1966 wept openly, because the woman who had held them together that night was finally being seen. Eleanor Hayes lived for another 3 years after that ceremony, and they were among the happiest years of her long and extraordinary life. She moved into a small cottage that Marcus helped her find, one with a garden where Ranger liked to nap in the afternoon sun. She began speaking at Naval Academy events, telling young midshipmen the unvarnished truth about what service had cost her and what it had given her in return. She wrote letters to the families of the men she had treated in Vietnam, finally able to share the stories she had been forbidden to tell for half a century. She passed away peacefully in her sleep in the spring of her 93rd year, with Marcus holding her hand and Ranger lying at the foot of her bed. She was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors, her grave marker bearing every single one of the decorations she had earned, including the ones the country had taken so long to acknowledge. Her story is not unusual in the way you might think. There are thousands of Eleanor Hayeses scattered across this country, elderly veterans whose service has been forgotten or minimized, women and men who gave everything and came home to silence, who now stretch fixed incomes across rising costs and wonder if anyone remembers what they did. What Eleanor's story teaches us is that recognition delayed is not recognition denied. That one person paying attention in a grocery store line can change the course of a forgotten life. And that the values we claim to honor as a nation, courage, sacrifice, perseverance, loyalty, only mean something when we honor them in the people who actually live them. Look around you. The hero you walk past today may be carrying a Navy Cross in her purse. Will you see her?